Captain Elijah Reynolds watches in silence as the flight attendant who falsely accused him of impersonating a pilot is escorted off the plane by security. Her face crumbles when she realizes her career is over, while passengers witness the aftermath of racial prejudice unfolding before their very first flight together begins. Before we dive into this shocking story of discrimination in the skies, where are you watching from today? If you've ever witnessed prejudice in professional settings, hit that like button now and subscribe to see more true stories of justice served. Let's see what events led to this dramatic confrontation and how a single phone call changed everything. The morning had started like any other for Captain Elijah Reynolds. His alarm beeped at 4:30, and within minutes he was brewing coffee in his Manhattan apartment with a view of planes taking off from JFK in the distance. At 42 years old, Elijah had established himself as one of the most skilled pilots at Atlantic Skyways, with 15 years of commercial flying experience and a wall of aviation awards that his colleagues secretly envied. As he adjusted his captain's hat in the mirror, Elijah couldn't help but feel a surge of pride mixed with lingering disbelief. Today marked his first flight as the permanent captain for Atlantic Skyways' prestigious new direct route between New York and Johannesburg. The airline had specifically chosen him for this high-profile assignment after his flawless safety record and exceptional passenger satisfaction ratings had caught the attention of the executive team. Yet even with these accomplishments, Elijah knew what many of his white colleagues didn't have to consider. He was still one of only 27 black captains in the entire airline, which employed over 800 pilots. The weight of representation never left his shoulders, even on the best days. "Remember what Admiral Washington used to say," Elijah muttered to himself as he straightened his uniform one final time. "Excellence is the only answer they can't question." Admiral James Washington had been Elijah's mentor since they'd met at a military air show when Elijah was just 16. The retired Navy admiral had taken an interest in the aviation-obsessed teenager and had guided his journey through flight school and into commercial aviation. Now serving on Atlantic Skyways' board of directors, the admiral remained Elijah's most trusted advisor and strongest advocate. Elijah glanced at his phone, seeing a text from the admiral. "Make history today, son. This route is just the beginning." The journey to this moment had been anything but smooth. Throughout his career, Elijah had faced countless microaggressions and outright discrimination. Passengers had requested different pilots upon seeing him. Colleagues had attributed his promotions to diversity initiatives rather than his exceptional skills. Flight attendants had sometimes questioned his directions, assuming he must be mistaken. One incident still stung years later. A passenger had handed Elijah her bag as he boarded in uniform, assuming he was a porter rather than the man who would fly her safely across the country. He had simply smiled, handed the bag to an actual porter, and proceeded to the cockpit. Excellence was indeed the only answer they couldn't question. As Elijah drove to JFK that morning, he received a call from his co-pilot, Michael Chen, who had become a close friend over the past 3 years of flying together. "Ready for the big day, Captain?" Michael asked, his voice energetic despite the early hour. "Born ready," Elijah replied, allowing himself a rare moment of unguarded excitement. "First day of a new era. And about time, too. I heard they're rolling out the red carpet for us in Johannesburg. First direct flight connection is a big deal for them." "For us, too," Elijah said. "This route is going to be a game changer for the airline." What neither man discussed, but both understood, was the significance of a black captain leading this historic route to Africa. The airline's marketing team had subtly highlighted this connection in their promotional materials, without explicitly mentioning Elijah's race, a balancing act that left him with mixed feelings. When Elijah arrived at the airport and entered the staff area, he noticed a few unfamiliar faces among the flight crew. Atlantic Skyways had assigned their top team for this inaugural flight, which meant working with some crew members who normally served other routes. Most nodded respectfully or offered congratulations as he passed. But he caught a subtle double-take from one flight attendant, a tall blonde woman who quickly looked away when their eyes met. Elijah had learned to read these small signals over the years and filed the moment away mentally. Not everyone would be comfortable with his authority, but his job was to ensure a safe, successful flight, not to win a popularity contest. In the briefing room, the flight crew gathered for their pre-departure meeting. Michael was already there, reviewing the flight plan with his characteristic thoroughness. The flight attendants filed in, including the blonde woman Elijah had noticed earlier. "Good morning, everyone," Elijah began, standing tall at the front of the room. "I'm Captain Elijah Reynolds, and I'll be serving as your permanent captain for the New York to Johannesburg route. Some of you I've worked with before, others I'm meeting for the first time today." He proceeded to outline the flight details, with precision, covering everything from the expected weather conditions to the cultural considerations for their South African destination. As he spoke, he noticed the blonde flight attendant whispering to her colleague, her eyes never leaving him but her expression suggesting doubt rather than attention. When he finished and asked for questions, she raised her hand immediately. "Victoria Harrington," she introduced herself, her voice carrying the polished accent of old money. "I was under the impression that Captain Richards would be heading this route. There seems to have been a last-minute change that wasn't properly communicated to the cabin crew." The implication was clear. She questioned whether Elijah was supposed to be there at all. "No last-minute changes, Ms. Harrington," Elijah replied evenly. "This assignment was finalized 3 months ago. Captain Richards is taking over the London route as of today." Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. My family has known Thomas Richards for years. He never mentioned being reassigned." Elijah noted the subtle dropping of her family connection and responded with a professional smile. "Airline business isn't typically discussed at social gatherings. Now, are there any questions about today's flight specifically?" The meeting continued without further interruptions, but Elijah could feel Victoria's eyes on him throughout. It wasn't an unfamiliar sensation. Some people simply couldn't reconcile their mental image of authority with his black face, regardless of the uniform he wore or the credentials he held. After the briefing, Michael approached him. "I see Victoria's going to be a pleasure to work with," he said quietly. "Nothing I haven't handled before," Elijah replied, gathering his paperwork. "Let's just focus on making this inaugural flight perfect." "Always do, Captain," Michael said with a grin. "That's why they put us on this route." As they headed toward the gate for final preparations, Elijah felt his phone vibrate with a message from Admiral Washington. "Proud of you today, son. Call if you need anything at all." Little did Elijah know just how soon he would need to take the Admiral up on that offer. Victoria Harrington had grown up with aviation in her blood. Her grandfather had been an airline executive, her father owned a private jet charter company, and her brother was a commercial pilot for a competing airline. The Harrington name carried weight in aviation circles, opening doors and commanding respect wherever it was mentioned. At 34, Victoria had spent 12 years as a flight attendant, predominantly serving first-class cabins on international routes. She prided herself on knowing all the captains by name and face, often hosting them at her family's Southampton home during summer gatherings. When she'd been assigned to the inaugural Johannesburg route, she'd assumed her family friend Thomas Richards would be captain, not this man she'd never seen before. As Victoria prepared the first-class cabin before boarding, she turned to her colleague, Rebecca Martinez. "Have you ever flown with this Captain Reynolds before?" she asked, arranging champagne flutes with practiced precision. Rebecca nodded. "Twice on the Paris route. He's excellent, actually. Super calm during turbulence over the Atlantic last month." Victoria pursed her lips. "Interesting. I've never seen him. And I know all our international captains. He's been flying domestically until recently, I think," Rebecca said, clearly uncomfortable with Victoria's tone. "But his reputation is stellar." Victoria responded, unconvinced. "I'm just surprised they'd put someone without international experience on our most prestigious new route." Rebecca gave her a look. "I wouldn't assume he lacks experience just because you haven't personally met him." Victoria ignored the comment and continued her preparations, her mind racing. Something felt off about this situation. She prided herself on knowing every detail about Atlantic Skyway's operations, particularly the pilots. Her family connections meant she often had information before it was officially announced. Yet somehow, this Captain Reynolds had been assigned to their most important new route without her knowledge. An hour before boarding was set to begin, Victoria made her way to the cockpit where Elijah and Michael were running through their pre-hull flight checklist. She knocked on the open door with a practiced smile. "Just wanted to introduce myself properly, Captain Reynolds. I'm Victoria Harrington, your lead flight attendant for first class." Elijah looked up and nodded. "Nice to meet you officially, Ms. Harrington. Looking forward to working together." Victoria's eyes scanned the cockpit, noting how comfortable he seemed in the captain's seat. "I was just curious about your background. I normally know all our international captains, but I don't believe we've crossed paths before." Elijah maintained his professional demeanor despite the thinly veiled questioning. "I've been with Atlantic for 12 years, primarily on domestic routes and as a training captain for new pilots. Before that, 5 years with the Air Force." "Air Force?" Victoria's eyebrows rose. "Not Navy? Most of our captains come from naval backgrounds." "The Air Force also produces excellent pilots," Michael interjected, his tone suggesting he'd picked up on Victoria's implications. "Of course," Victoria replied smoothly. "I'm just trying to understand the selection process for this particular route. It's quite prestigious." "The selection process was thorough," Elijah said, his voice remaining even. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to finish our preparations." Victoria nodded and left, but her suspicions remained. She made her way to the gate agent's desk and smiled at the supervisor she'd known for years. "Linda, quick question. Was there a last-minute change to the captain assignment for this flight?" Linda looked confused. "Not that I'm aware of. Captain Reynolds has been scheduled for months." "Reynolds," Victoria repeated, frowning slightly. "And he's one of our regular captains?" "Absolutely," Linda replied. "One of our best, from what I hear. Is there a problem?" No problem," Victoria said quickly. "Just making sure I have all the correct information for our passengers." As boarding time approached, Elijah realized he had spilled coffee on his uniform jacket. With just enough time before passengers would begin boarding, he hurried to the pilot's lounge to change into his spare jacket. As he rushed back toward the gate in his white shirt and pants without his jacket or hat, he nearly collided with Victoria. "Excuse me," he said, stepping aside. Victoria glanced at him, then did a double take. Without his complete uniform, she seemed not to recognize him immediately. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone shifting to one she might use with a passenger. "No, thank you. Just heading back to the gate," Elijah replied, continuing past her. Victoria watched him walk away, then followed at a distance. When she saw him approach the jet bridge entrance, she quickened her pace. "Excuse me, sir," she called out. "That area is for authorized personnel only." Elijah turned, surprised at being addressed this way. "Yes, I know, I'm the captain." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "The captain? Without your uniform jacket or credentials displayed?" "I had a coffee spill and just changed my jacket." "It's in my hand," Elijah explained, holding up the garment bag. "I'm Captain Reynolds." Victoria crossed her arms. "I just met Captain Reynolds in the cockpit." "That was me," Elijah said, his patience wearing thin but his voice remaining controlled. "You can accompany me to the cockpit if you need confirmation." "I'll need to see your ID first," Victoria insisted. "We have strict security protocols." Elijah reached for his credential wallet, only to realize it must have been left in his soiled jacket pocket. "It seems I've left my physical ID in my other jacket." "But you literally spoke to me 15 minutes ago in the cockpit." "Anyone could make that claim," Victoria said, her voice rising slightly. "Without proper identification, I cannot allow you to board this aircraft." By now, several passengers waiting to board were watching the exchange with interest. Elijah, aware of the growing audience and the delicate situation, tried a different approach. "My first officer, Michael Chen, can verify my identity, or you can call the gate supervisor." "I'm not comfortable with that," Victoria replied firmly. "In fact, I'm going to need to call security." Before Elijah could respond, Victoria had picked up the gate phone and was speaking rapidly. Security to Gate 12, potential security breach. Individual attempting to access the aircraft without proper credentials. Elijah stood in disbelief as Victoria turned to the waiting passengers with a reassuring smile. Ladies and gentlemen, we're just handling a security matter. Boarding will commence shortly. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers arrived. Victoria immediately approached them. This man is trying to board our aircraft claiming to be the captain, but he doesn't have identification and isn't in proper uniform, she explained, pointing to Elijah. One of the officers turned to Elijah. Sir, can you identify yourself? I'm Captain Elijah Reynolds, he replied calmly. I had a coffee spill and changed my jacket, apparently leaving my physical ID in the pocket. But my first officer is in the cockpit and can verify my identity, as can the gate supervisor. The officers exchange glances. We'll need to verify this. Please step aside while we sort this out. As Elijah was moved away from the boarding area, he maintained his composure despite the humiliation of being detained in front of passengers he was supposed to be commanding. He noticed some passengers taking out their phones, undoubtedly recording the incident. Contact First Officer Michael Chen immediately, Elijah instructed the officers. He's in the cockpit and can confirm who I am. One officer radioed for someone to check with the cockpit, while Victoria stood nearby, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and concern. The gate area had grown silent as everyone watched the drama unfold. I don't understand why you're being difficult, Victoria said loudly enough for others to hear. Security protocols exist for everyone's safety. Elijah met her gaze directly. Is it protocol to fail to recognize the captain you met face-to-face 15 minutes ago? Victoria flushed slightly. In that brief interaction, without proper uniform identifiers, how could anyone be certain? For all I know, you could have just seen the real captain enter earlier, and now you're trying to impersonate him. The absurdity of her statement hung in the air. Several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, and one older black woman shook her head slowly. Just then, Michael came rushing down the jet bridge, his face flushed with anger. What the hell is going on here? This is Captain Reynolds, our pilot. We were just reviewing flight plans together. The security officers looked confused. Sir, can you positively identify this individual as Captain Reynolds? Of course I can, Michael exclaimed. We've flown together for 3 years. What is this about? Victoria stepped forward. He couldn't produce identification and isn't wearing his proper uniform. I was simply following security protocols. Michael turned to her incredulously. You literally introduced yourself to him in the cockpit minutes ago. How could you possibly not recognize him? Victoria's composure faltered slightly. Without the proper uniform indicators, in a crowded terminal. This is ridiculous, Michael interrupted. Officers, this is our captain, and we have a flight to prepare for. The officers seemed ready to release Elijah, but Victoria wasn't backing down. I still need to see proper identification before allowing him on board, she insisted. Those are airline protocols. Elijah, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. Very well. If my first officer's confirmation isn't sufficient, it seems I need to make a call. He pulled out his phone, aware that this escalation would have consequences, but seeing no other option to resolve the situation without further delaying the flight and embarrassing himself in front of more passengers. As he dialed, the assembled group watched in tense silence, unaware that this single phone call was about to dramatically alter the course of everyone's day, especially Victoria Harrington's. Elijah's finger hovered over the contact name for just a moment before he pressed the call button. Admiral James Washington. The name glowed on his phone screen as he put the device to his ear, maintaining direct eye contact with Victoria. The significance of that name was lost on most people gathered around the gate area, but Victoria's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. In aviation circles, particularly at Atlantic Skyways, Admiral Washington's name carried weight that few others could match. Have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated your connections? Comment number 1 if you've ever had to pull out your power card when faced with discrimination, or number 2 if you believe Victoria was just doing her job. Like and subscribe to see how this confrontation reaches its breaking point. "Admiral," Elijah said when the call connected, his voice steady despite the tension surrounding him. "I apologize for disturbing you, but I'm experiencing an unusual situation at JFK that requires immediate resolution." Victoria's confident posture began to falter as she overheard the exchange. The security officers glanced at each other, suddenly, unsure if they were handling the situation correctly. "Yes, sir. Gate 12, the Johannesburg flight," Elijah continued. "A flight attendant has reported me as attempting to impersonate myself and has called security, despite having met me in the cockpit earlier. I appear to have left my physical ID in my jacket after changing due to a coffee spill." The gathered passengers watched in silence as the power dynamic shifted before their eyes. Michael stood beside Elijah, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and lingering anger. "Thank you, Admiral. I appreciate it," Elijah said before ending the call. He lowered the phone and addressed the security officers. "Admiral Washington, board member of Atlantic Skyways, has contacted the Chief Operations Officer. He should be arriving momentarily." 15 years earlier, Elijah had been an eager 16-year-old attending his first air show in Baltimore. Aviation had already captured his imagination, but the possibility of becoming a pilot had seemed like a distant dream for a kid from his neighborhood. That day, as he'd stood mesmerized by the precision flying of the Blue Angels, a tall man in a crisp Navy uniform had noticed his interest. "You like planes, son?" the man had asked. "Yes, sir," Elijah had replied immediately. "More than anything, Admiral James Washington," the man had introduced himself, extending his hand. "And what's your name, future pilot?" That chance encounter had changed the trajectory of Elijah's life. The Admiral had taken an interest in the bright, aviation-obsessed teenager, arranging for flight lessons and mentoring him through the challenges of entering a field where few people looked like him. When obstacles appeared, as they inevitably did, the Admiral's guidance and connections had helped navigate around them. Now, as Elijah waited for the COO to arrive, he reflected on how rarely he'd needed to invoke the Admiral's name or authority. He'd always preferred to stand on his own merits, to let his skills speak for themselves. But some situations required exceptional measures. 5 minutes passed in uncomfortable silence. Passengers continued to watch, some openly recording the incident on their phones. Victoria had stepped aside to confer with another flight attendant, her expression increasingly worried. Then, Timothy Brooks, the airline's chief operations officer, came striding purposefully through the terminal, accompanied by 2 airline executives. His presence at a boarding gate was unprecedented, a clear indication of the seriousness with which the Admiral's call had been taken. "Captain Reynolds," he called out as he approached, extending his hand. "I understand there's been some confusion about your identity." "That's putting it mildly, sir," Elijah replied, shaking the offered hand. Brooks turned to the security officers. "Gentlemen, I can personally verify that this is Captain Elijah Reynolds, one of our most valued pilots. There's been a misunderstanding." The officers immediately stepped back, looking relieved to be absolved of further responsibility. "Thank you for clarifying, sir. We were just responding to a security call." "And who initiated this call?" Brooks asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Victoria stepped forward, her composure visibly shaken but attempting to maintain a professional demeanor. "I did, sir. Victoria Harrington. I was following security protocols when confronted with someone attempting to board without visible identification." Brooks studied her for a moment. "Ms. Harrington, Captain Reynolds is the assigned pilot for this route and has been for months. He met with you in the cockpit earlier. Are you saying you failed to recognize the captain of your own flight?" Victoria swallowed hard. "In the terminal, without his jacket and credentials, I was simply exercising caution, sir." "Caution is commendable, Ms. Harrington, but this goes beyond caution," Brooks replied coldly. "This appears to be a significant lapse in judgment that has delayed our inaugural flight and created a public scene." He glanced around at the passengers still, waiting to board, many openly watching the confrontation unfold, not to mention the potential damage to our airline's reputation. Victoria's face paled. "Sir, I was only trying to follow security protocols." "Security protocols don't include failing to recognize senior staff you've personally met," Brooks said firmly. My office has already received multiple calls about this incident, including from Admiral Washington himself. At the mention of the Admiral's name, Victoria seemed to physically shrink. Admiral Washington is involved? He sits on our board, Ms. Harrington, and takes a personal interest in Captain Reynolds' career, Brooks confirmed, and he's deeply concerned about what's transpired here. Victoria's eyes darted to Elijah, a new understanding dawning. I wasn't aware of your connection to the Admiral, Captain, she said quietly. There are many things you weren't aware of before making assumptions, Ms. Harrington, Elijah replied evenly. Brooks turned to one of the executives who had accompanied him. Sarah, please escort Ms. Harrington to HR. She'll be removed from this flight immediately. Victoria gasped. Removed? But sir, I was only following what I believe to be proper procedure. This is not the place for this discussion, Brooks said firmly. There will be a formal review of this incident. For now, you are suspended pending that review. Suspended? Victoria's voice rose in disbelief. Over a security precaution? Over what appears to be, at minimum, a serious error in judgment, Brooks clarified. Now please go with Sarah without creating further disruption. As reality sank in, Victoria's professional facade finally cracked. This will ruin my career, she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. My family. You should have considered that before causing this scene, Brooks replied without sympathy. Now we need to get this flight back on schedule. As Victoria was led away, her face crumpled with the realization that her career might indeed be over. The passengers witnessed the aftermath of what many had already recognized as racial prejudice, an uncomfortable reality exposed before their journey had even begun. Brooks turned back to Elijah. Captain Reynolds, I sincerely apologize for this incident. Is there anything you need before proceeding with the flight? Elijah shook his head. No, sir. I just want to get these passengers to Johannesburg safely and on schedule. Of course, Brooks nodded. We'll need a replacement flight attendant. I've already called for one who should arrive shortly. As Brooks handled the logistics, Michael stepped closer to Elijah. You okay? He asked quietly. I'll have to be, Elijah replied. We have a flight to Captain. For what it's worth, you handled that with more grace than I would have, Michael said. Elijah gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, but his mind was already transitioning back to the responsibilities awaiting him. The incident had been resolved, but the emotional aftermath would need to be processed later. For now, he had a historic flight to focus on, and passengers who needed reassurance after witnessing the troubling scene. As the replacement flight attendant arrived and boarding preparations resumed, Elijah put on his jacket and captain's hat, the visible symbols of authority that Victoria had claimed not to recognize. He stepped forward to address the waiting passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We'll begin boarding shortly, and I want to assure you that once we're in the air, you'll experience the exceptional service Atlantic Skyways is known for. Thank you for your patience. Many passengers nodded approvingly, some even applauded. The older black woman who had shaken her head earlier caught Elijah's eye and gave him a knowing smile of solidarity. As Elijah turned to head down the jet bridge, his phone buzzed with a text from Admiral Washington. Issue resolved. Proud of how you handled it. Have a safe flight, son. How would you have responded in Elijah's situation? Would you have maintained his level of composure, or would you have reacted differently? And what awaits our captain now that this confrontation has been resolved, but the emotional impact remains? The journey is just beginning. The cockpit of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner felt like a sanctuary to Elijah as he settled into the captain's seat. Here, surrounded by the familiar array of instruments and controls, his authority was unquestionable. The aircraft responded to his commands without prejudice or suspicion, requiring only competence and skill, qualities he possessed in abundance. Michael completed the pre-flight checklist beside him. Both men focused on their tasks with heightened concentration after the disruption at the gate. External power connected. APU start sequence initiated, Michael reported, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of thousands of previous flights. Elijah nodded. Confirmed. Flight computer is online. programming our route now. Neither man mentioned Victoria Harrington or the incident that had delayed their departure by 20 minutes. They were professionals, and the safety of the 286 passengers now settling into their seats remained their primary concern. Only when the critical pre-flight procedures were completed did Michael break their unspoken agreement. "Hell of a way to start our inaugural flight," he said quietly. Elijah allowed himself a small sigh. "Not how I plan to make history today." For what it's worth, Brooks handled it well. Immediate suspension was the right call. It was, Elijah agreed, though part of him took no pleasure in Victoria's public humiliation, despite her actions. "Let's just focus on giving these passengers an exceptional flight experience. Many of them witnessed that scene, and they need to feel confident in their captain." A knock at the cockpit door interrupted their conversation. The replacement flight attendant entered after Michael unlocked the door. She was a woman in her mid-30s with dark skin and a warm smile that brightened noticeably when she saw Elijah. "Captain Reynolds, I'm Jasmine Williams. I'll be taking over as lead flight attendant for first class. Just wanted to introduce myself properly before we take off." Elijah nodded in greeting. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Ms. Williams." "Happy to help," she replied, her eyes conveying more than her words. "And it's an honor to be part of this historic flight with you, Captain." The subtle acknowledgement of their shared racial identity and the significance of his position wasn't lost on Elijah. He'd encountered it before with other black aviation professionals, this unspoken solidarity in a predominantly white industry. "Cabin preparation status?" Elijah asked, transitioning to business. "All passengers boarded, stowage secured, cabin crew ready," Jasmine reported efficiently. "Cabin crew has been briefed on the situation, and we're all committed to making this a smooth experience for everyone." "Thank you, Ms. Williams. We'll be pushing back shortly." After Jasmine left, Michael turned to Elijah. "She seems competent." "Very," Elijah agreed. "Makes me wonder why she wasn't assigned to this flight originally." Both men knew the answer, but left it unspoken. In the airline industry, as in many others, the most prestigious assignments didn't always reflect merit alone. As they began the pushback from the gate, Elijah's thoughts drifted to similar incidents throughout his career. The passenger who had requested a different pilot after seeing him enter the cockpit. The air traffic controller who had questioned his clearance with unusual persistence. The countless times he'd been asked if he was in the right line when queuing for crew security. Each incident had been a reminder that no matter how perfect his landings or how extensive his knowledge, his competence would always be questioned by some based solely on his appearance. The aircraft's engines roared to life, a sound that had never failed to thrill Elijah since his first flight lesson. He guided the massive Dreamliner through the taxiway with practiced precision, listening to the air traffic controller's instructions and responding with the calm authority that had become his professional signature. "Atlantic 427 Heavy, you are cleared for takeoff on runway 31L. Wind 270 at 8 knots. "Atlantic 427 Heavy, cleared for takeoff runway 31L, Elijah confirmed, then nodded to Michael. "Let's make this one perfect." The takeoff was indeed flawless. The powerful aircraft accelerating smoothly down the runway before lifting gracefully into the clear blue sky above New York. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, Elijah felt some of the tension from the earlier confrontation begin to dissipate. "Textbook takeoff, Captain," Michael commented as they leveled at their initial cruising altitude. "Those passengers are in good hands." "Our hands," Elijah corrected him. "This is a team effort." 3 hours into the flight, as they crossed the Atlantic with the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, Elijah received a call from the cabin. "Captain, the CEO is on the line for you," Jasmine informed him. "Would you like to take it in the cockpit or privately?" Elijah exchanged a glance with Michael. A call from the CEO mid-flight was unprecedented. "I'll take it here," he decided, picking up the handset. "This is Captain Reynolds." "Elijah, this is Patricia Winters," came the voice of Atlantic Skyway's CEO. "I've just been briefed on the incident at JFK. I wanted to personally apologize for what you experienced today." "Thank you, Ms. Winters. I appreciate the call." This is not how we want any of our employees to be treated, especially not someone of your caliber on such an important day for our airline, she continued. I want you to know that we're taking this extremely seriously. Ms. Harrington's actions do not reflect our values as a company. I understand, Elijah replied, conscious of Michael listening beside him. What matters now is completing this flight safely. Of course, Winters agreed. But when you return, I'd like to meet with you personally. We need to ensure nothing like this happens again. After the call ended, Michael raised an eyebrow. CEO calling mid-flight. That's a first. Admiral Washington's influence, Elijah explained. He doesn't call in favors often, but when he does, people listen. Good. They should listen, Michael said firmly. What happened today wasn't just about security protocols. We both know that. Elijah nodded slowly. We do, but proving it is always the challenge. During their meal break, with the relief co-pilot temporarily taking Michael's place, Elijah found himself reflecting on why Victoria's actions had hurt beyond the immediate confrontation. It wasn't just the humiliation of being detained in front of passengers or having his authority questioned. It was the painful reminder that no matter how high he climbed, no matter what he achieved, some people would always see his skin color before they saw his captain's stripes. When he returned from his break, Jasmine approached him in the galley area, away from passengers. Some of the passengers who witnessed what happened have been asking about you, she said quietly. They're impressed with how you handled it. One gentleman in 3A said, and I quote, "That captain has more class in his little finger than that flight attendant had in her whole body." Elijah smiled slightly. Thank you for telling me. It matters, you know, Jasmine continued. Having you in that captain's seat. When I started as a flight attendant 12 years ago, I could count the black captains I worked with on one hand, with fingers to spare. It's still not enough, Elijah replied. The numbers haven't improved much. But they're improving, Jasmine insisted. And every successful flight you captain makes it harder for the Victoria Harringtons of the world to question the next black pilot. As their conversation ended, Elijah returned to the cockpit with Jasmine's words resonating in his mind. She was right, of course. Each barrier broken made the path slightly easier for those who followed. Admiral Washington had understood this decades ago when he'd taken an interest in a teenager at an air show. The flight progressed smoothly across the Atlantic and down the African continent. Elijah and Michael worked in seamless coordination, their years of flying together evident in their efficient communication and shared anticipation of each other's needs. As they began their descent into Johannesburg, the city lights twinkling in the early morning darkness below, Elijah felt a sense of accomplishment that transcended the day's earlier difficulties. They were making history, establishing a direct connection between two continents, bringing people closer together across vast distances. Beginning final approach, Elijah announced, his voice steady and confident over the intercom. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing. The landing was as perfect as the takeoff had been, the massive aircraft touching down on South African soil with barely a bump. As they taxied to the gate, Elijah could see the water cannon salute traditionally given to inaugural flights, the powerful jets creating a sparkling arch over the aircraft. Welcome to Johannesburg, Captain, Michael said with a smile. First of many. First of many, Elijah agreed, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment despite the day's challenges. As they completed the shutdown procedures, Jasmine returned to the cockpit. Captain, there are several journalists waiting at the gate. Apparently word of the incident in New York has reached them already. Elijah frowned. That was fast. Social media, Michael said, shaking his head. Those passengers recording everything. I should have known this would go viral. The revelation that what he'd considered a personal and professional humiliation might now be public knowledge sent a wave of discomfort through Elijah. He'd handled the situation with dignity, but having it dissected by strangers online was another matter entirely. I'll handle the media, he decided, straightening his uniform. This is still a historic day for the airline, and that should be the focus. As passengers disembarked, many nodded respectfully or offered words of encouragement to Elijah. The incident had clearly colored their perception of him, for better or worse. Some seemed to regard him with newfound respect, while others appeared uncomfortable, perhaps reconsidering their own biases. One passenger, an elderly black South African man, stopped in front of Elijah. "Captain, I was a pilot too during apartheid. Couldn't fly internationally then. Seeing you bring this plane in today means more than you know." The unexpected connection across generations and continents caught Elijah off guard. "Thank you, sir. That means a great deal to me." The first leg of their historic journey was complete, but as Elijah prepared to face the waiting journalists, he knew that the repercussions of Victoria Harrington's actions were only beginning to unfold. The moment Elijah stepped into the arrival terminal at OR Tambo International Airport, the flashes of cameras temporarily blinded him. At least a dozen journalists had gathered, their questions overlapping in an eager cacophony. "Captain Reynolds, can you comment on the incident at JFK? Was the flight attendant's action racially motivated? How do you feel about becoming a viral sensation overnight?" Viral sensation. The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. What had been a deeply personal humiliation had apparently become public spectacle while he was crossing oceans at 35,000 feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, raising his hand slightly to quiet the journalists. "Today marks a historic achievement for Atlantic Skyways and for connections between our countries. This inaugural direct flight from New York to Johannesburg represents a new chapter in transatlantic travel." A persistent reporter pressed forward. "Captain Reynolds, a video showing you being detained at JFK has over 2 million views already. Passengers are calling it a clear case of racial profiling. Would you agree with that assessment?" 2 million views. Elijah maintained his composed expression through years of practice, but internally he felt exposed in a way that was entirely foreign to his private nature. "I'm not in a position to comment on an ongoing internal airline matter," he replied diplomatically. "What I can tell you is that Atlantic Skyways has always maintained the highest standards of professionalism, and I'm proud to represent the airline on this historic route." Another journalist called out, "The flight attendant has been identified on social media as Victoria Harrington. Sources say her family has deep connections in the aviation industry. Did those connections play a role in her position at the airline?" Elijah shook his head. "Again, I cannot comment on personnel matters. My focus remains on providing safe, excellent service to our passengers." Despite his attempts to redirect the conversation to the inaugural flight, the journalists continued to press for details about the confrontation. The story clearly had all the elements that drove engagement: race, authority, privilege, and a dramatic resolution captured on video for the world to see. After 15 uncomfortable minutes, the airline's South African public relations representative intervened, thanking the journalists and guiding Elijah toward a waiting car. "I'm sorry about that, Captain," she said once they were seated in the vehicle. "We weren't prepared for this level of media interest. The story exploded while you were in the air." Michael, who had joined them in the car, pulled out his phone. "You might want to see this, Elijah." He handed over his phone, displaying a Twitter feed. The hashtag #Captain Reynolds was trending, alongside Tyke's flying while black and Karen in the air. The video, apparently shot by a passenger waiting to board, showed the confrontation from Elijah's arrival at the gate through Victoria's removal. Elijah watched a portion of the video with growing discomfort before handing the phone back. "This isn't what I wanted." "I know," Michael replied sympathetically, "but people are overwhelmingly supporting you. That's something, at least." At their hotel, Elijah found several voice messages waiting. His parents, his sister, friends from flight school, even former passengers had all reached out after seeing the video online. Each message expressed outrage on his behalf, support for his composure, or some combination of both. The last message was from Admiral Washington. "Elijah, I've seen the video. Call me as soon as you land, regardless of the hour." Before he could return any calls, Elijah's phone rang with the airline's headquarters number. "Captain Reynolds, this is Diane from PR. I'm calling to inform you that the airline will be issuing a statement about today's incident. We wanted to give you a courtesy heads up." "What will the statement say?" Elijah asked. It will affirm our zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and confirm that the flight attendant involved has been suspended pending a full investigation." "I see," Elijah said, noting that they weren't actually addressing what had happened, just the procedural aftermath. "We'd also like to request that you refrain from speaking to the media about this incident," Diane continued, "as this is an internal matter." "I understand," Elijah interrupted, familiar with corporate damage control. "I've already declined to comment to journalists here." "Excellent. We appreciate your professionalism, Captain." After the call ended, Elijah finally reached Admiral Washington. "The video doesn't show the half of it," the Admiral said after initial greetings. "That woman should be terminated, not just suspended." "The airline's investigating," Elijah replied, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the long flight and emotional day. "Investigating what?" the Admiral demanded. "It's all on video. She failed to recognize you after meeting you face-to-face, called security on you without cause, and created a public spectacle that embarrassed both you and the airline." "You know how these things work," Elijah said wearily. "They have to follow procedures." The Admiral's voice softened slightly. "How are you really doing, son?" "I've had better days," Elijah admitted. "Finding out I've gone viral while I was flying wasn't exactly on my bucket list." "People are rallying behind you," the Admiral pointed out. "This could be an opportunity to address larger issues in the industry." The suggestion gave Elijah pause. He'd always navigated his career carefully, avoiding being labeled as an activist or troublemaker. "I'm not sure that's my role." "Just think about it," the Admiral advised. "Sometimes leadership means more than flying the plane." As the evening progressed, Elijah's phone continued to light up with notifications. His sister texted that she'd been contacted by 3 national news programs seeking interviews with him. College friends reported that their social media was flooded with the story. Even his parents, who rarely use social media, had seen the video shared by concerned church members. After ordering room service, Elijah finally allowed himself to watch the full video that had captured the world's attention. Seeing the incident from an outside perspective was strange, almost as if it had happened to someone else. The camera had caught Victoria's dismissive expression, the security officer's initial skepticism toward him, and the dramatic arrival of the COO. It had also captured his own calm demeanor throughout, a composure that many commenters praised, but which he knew had been hard-won through years of similar if less public encounters. As he scrolled through comments beneath the video, one caught his attention. "This isn't just about one flight attendant. This is about the systems that made her comfortable questioning a black captain in the first place." The comment had thousands of likes and had sparked its own lengthy thread of responses. Elijah found himself reading deeply into these conversations, struck by how many people were using his experience to reflect on broader patterns of discrimination. A knock at his hotel room door interrupted his reading. Michael stood in the hallway, holding his tablet. "You've seen it?" he asked, entering the room. Elijah nodded. "Just watch the whole thing." "It's everywhere," Michael said, sitting down heavily in an armchair. "And now Victoria's made a statement." "Already?" Elijah was surprised. "The airline PR team specifically asked me not to comment." "Well, she didn't get the same memo, apparently," Michael replied, turning his tablet toward Elijah. Victoria's statement was brief but calculated. "I deeply regret the misunderstanding that occurred. Today, as aviation professionals, our first priority is always passenger safety. When security protocols appear to be breached, we are trained to act swiftly. At no point were my actions motivated by anything other than concern for proper procedure. I apologize for any confusion caused." Elijah read it twice before speaking. Notice she doesn't apologize to me directly, and she's still implying there was a legitimate security concern. Classic non-apology, Michael agreed. And the comments aren't buying it either. He scrolled down to show Elijah the responses, which overwhelmingly called out Victoria's statement as inadequate and deflective. "Some good news, though," Michael continued. "The South African Tourism Board wants to host a special reception for us tomorrow, calling the direct flight a historic connection between nations. At least someone's focusing on the actual achievement." Elijah managed a tired smile. "That is good news," We should try to enjoy at least part of this trip." After Michael left, Elijah found himself unable to sleep despite the exhaustion. The day's events kept replaying in his mind, along with the Admiral's suggestion that this could be an opportunity for broader impact. His phone buzzed with yet another notification. A civil rights organization had issued a statement using his experience as an example of ongoing discrimination in professional environments, and they were requesting an interview. As Elijah finally drifted toward sleep in the early hours of the morning, he wrestled with conflicting instincts. His lifelong approach of letting his work speak for itself versus the growing recognition that his voice might now carry weight beyond the cockpit. The inaugural flight had indeed made history, though not entirely in the way he had anticipated. And as Johannesburg's dawn broke outside his window, Elijah realized that returning to New York would mean facing not just airline executives and an internal investigation, but a public conversation about race and authority that his viral moment had unexpectedly thrust him into the center of. The sleek conference room on the 38th floor of Atlantic Skyway's Manhattan headquarters offered panoramic views of the city, but no one seated around the polished table was admiring the scenery. 3 days after the viral incident, Elijah found himself facing the airline's executive team, including CEO Patricia Winters, COO Timothy Brooks, and the head of human resources, Alicia Morales. Have you ever been in a meeting where you knew you were right, but still felt like you were on trial? Comment number 1, if you believe large corporations genuinely care about addressing discrimination. Or number 2, if you think they're mostly concerned with public relations. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see how Elijah confronts the airline's leadership. Captain Reynolds, thank you for joining us today, Winters began, her tone professionally warm. Before we discuss the incident, I want to reiterate that your handling of the inaugural flight was exemplary, especially given the circumstances. The feedback from passengers has been overwhelmingly positive. Thank you, Elijah replied simply, aware that pleasantries were merely prelude. Brooks leaned forward. We've completed our preliminary investigation into Ms. Harrington's actions at JFK. Based on security footage and witness statements, her claim that she didn't recognize you after your earlier face-to-face meeting is questionable at best. That's putting it mildly, Elijah commented, maintaining eye contact. Morales, the HR director, consulted her tablet. Ms. Harrington has been with Atlantic Skyways for 12 years with generally positive performance reviews. However, we've discovered some concerning patterns during our investigation. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were 3 separate complaint forms, all filed by minority staff members against Victoria over the past 4 years. One from a black gate agent who claimed Victoria had repeatedly questioned his security clearance. Another from a Hispanic flight attendant who alleged Victoria had corrected her English unnecessarily and publicly. A third from an Asian American trainee who reported that Victoria had suggested she would be more suited to domestic routes with higher Asian populations. These complaints were investigated at the time, Morales explained, but each was handled separately by different HR representatives. No one connected the dots. Or no one wanted to, Elijah suggested quietly. An uncomfortable silence followed his comment. The implication was clear. Victoria's behavior had been a known problem that the airline had failed to address systemically. What's most concerning, Brooks continued, is that we've learned Ms. Harrington has powerful connections within the industry through her family. There's evidence suggesting previous complaints were minimized due to those connections. Elijah nodded slowly. This confirmed what he had suspected from the moment Victoria had mentioned her family's relationship with Captain Richards. What's the airline planning to do about Ms. Harrington? He asked directly. Winters and Brooks exchanged glances before the CEO replied. She's currently on paid administrative leave while we complete our investigation. Our standard protocol would typically involve sensitivity training and a formal reprimand for a first officially documented offense. First documented offense? Elijah repeated, his voice remaining calm but taking on an edge. Those 3 complaints in that folder suggest a pattern, not an isolated incident. Technically, Morales interjected, none of those complaints resulted in formal disciplinary action, so they don't constitute official offenses under our current policy. Elijah took a moment to process this information. The bureaucratic language was familiar, a way for institutions to acknowledge problems while avoiding meaningful action. So Victoria Harrington publicly humiliates me, causes our inaugural flight to be delayed, creates a PR nightmare for the airline, and the consequence is paid leave followed by sensitivity training, he summarized. We understand your frustration, Winters said quickly. But we have established procedures that protect people like Victoria Harrington and fail people who look like me, Elijah interrupted, his composure intact, but his patience waning. Let me be clear about something. What happened at JFK wasn't an isolated incident for me. It was just the first time it was caught on video and went viral. He leaned forward, making eye contact with each executive in turn. Throughout my 15 years with this airline, I've been questioned, second-guessed, and disrespected despite my qualifications. I've had passengers request different pilots. I've had crew members verify my instructions with white co-pilots. I've been asked to show ID in situations where none of my white colleagues would be. The executives shifted uncomfortably as Elijah continued. I've never filed formal complaints because I've always believed in letting my work speak for itself. But that approach allows the Victoria Harringtons of this industry to continue their behavior unchecked, while people who look like me bear the burden of their prejudice. The conference room fell silent as his words hung in the air. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, jets could be seen taking off from LaGuardia in the distance, tiny silver specks carrying people across vast differences of geography and experience. Finally, Brooks spoke. What would you like to see happen, Captain Reynolds? It was a fair question, and one Elijah had given considerable thought to during the flight back from Johannesburg. First, Victoria Harrington should be terminated, not suspended, he stated firmly. Her actions weren't a misunderstanding or a procedural error. They were the culmination of a pattern of behavior that the airline has failed to address until it became a public relations issue. Winters began to object, but Elijah raised his hand slightly. Second, Atlantic Skyways needs to examine its complaint procedures. Why were 3 separate complaints against the same employee never connected? Why were they all dismissed without formal action? That suggests a systemic problem, not just an individual one. Morales made notes on her tablet as Elijah continued. Third, the airline needs to look at its hiring and promotion practices. I'm still one of only 27 black captains out of 800 pilots. That's just over 3% in an industry serving a diverse global population. Those numbers haven't significantly improved in the decade I've been flying for Atlantic. We have diversity initiatives in place, Winters pointed out defensively. Initiatives that clearly aren't working, Elijah countered, or aren't being implemented effectively. Before Winters could respond, the conference room door opened and Admiral Washington entered, his presence immediately commanding attention. Sorry I'm late, he said, though his tone suggested the timing was intentional. Traffic was worse than expected. The executive straightened visibly as the Admiral took a seat beside Elijah. Though retired from military service for years, Washington still carried himself with the authority of his former rank, enhanced now by his position on the airline's board. Admiral, Winters greeted him with obvious surprise. We weren't expecting you at this meeting. I thought my perspective might be valuable, Washington replied smoothly, especially given my history with both Captain Reynolds and this airline. Winters nodded, clearly recalibrating her approach. We were just discussing appropriate responses to the incident at JFK. Excellent, the Admiral said. And what conclusions have you reached? Brooks cleared his throat. We're still in the evaluation phase, but we're considering a range of disciplinary actions for Ms. Harrington, along with potential changes to our reporting procedures. The Admiral's expression remained neutral, but his voice took on a steely quality. I've reviewed the video, the witness statements, and the HR file that was just shared with Captain Reynolds. This isn't a complex case requiring lengthy evaluation. Ms. Harrington's actions were clearly inappropriate and potentially discriminatory. We have to follow due process, Admiral, Morales began. Due process doesn't mean indefinite delay, Washington countered. And it certainly doesn't mean protecting employees who violate our stated values because of their family connections. The reference to Victoria's connections wasn't subtle, and it landed with visible impact. Winters shifted in her seat before responding. "Admiral Washington, I assure you we take this matter seriously, but terminating a 12-year employee with a generally positive record over a single incident, however public, raises its own concerns." Washington leaned forward. "Does it? Let me remind everyone that this single incident was witnessed by dozens of passengers, recorded and viewed by millions online, and has already damaged our airline's reputation. More importantly, it's part of a documented pattern that your own HR department has now confirmed." The meeting's dynamic had shifted dramatically with Washington's arrival. What had begun as a management exercise in damage control was evolving into something more consequential. A knock at the door preceded the entrance of a junior executive assistant. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you should see," she said, turning on the conference room's large display screen. The screen showed a live news broadcast where several Black Atlantic Skyways employees were gathered outside the headquarters building. The chyron at the bottom read, "Airline staff rally in support of Captain Reynolds, demand action on discrimination." Among the group was Jasmine Williams, the flight attendant who had replaced Victoria on the Johannesburg flight. She was speaking to a reporter. "What happened to Captain Reynolds isn't an isolated incident. Many of us have experienced similar treatment but haven't had the protection of viral videos to bring attention to our stories." The executives watched in stunned silence as the camera panned to show at least 30 airline employees, including pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, and ground crew. Elijah himself was surprised by the demonstration. He had spoken to several colleagues since returning to New York, but had no idea they were planning this public action. Winters quickly directed the assistant to turn off the display. "This is getting out of hand," she said, her composed demeanor showing cracks. "We need to issue a statement immediately." "Before you do," Elijah said, a new resolve in his voice, "you should know that I've been contacted by 17 minority employees since the incident, all sharing similar experiences. This isn't about one flight attendant or one captain. This is about a culture that allows these incidents to occur repeatedly without consequence." He placed his hands flat on the table and continued, "I've been offered a platform to speak about these issues by several major news outlets. Until now, I've declined, out of loyalty to this airline. But if Atlantic Skyways can't demonstrate meaningful commitment to change, I'll have no choice but to share my experiences publicly." The implied ultimatum hung in the air. Elijah had never considered himself an activist, but the events of the past week had shown him that sometimes leadership required more than quiet excellence. "What exactly are you asking for, Captain Reynolds?" Winters asked, her tone carefully measured. "I've already told you. Victoria Harrington's termination, a complete overhaul of complaint procedures, and meaningful action on diversity in hiring, and promotion." He paused before adding, "And I want to be part of implementing those changes." Washington nodded approvingly beside him. Brooks leaned toward Winters and whispered something. The CEO's expression shifted from resistance to resignation. "We'll need time to consider the full scope of your requests," she finally said. "But I can tell you now that Ms. Harrington's employment will be terminated, effective immediately." It was a start, but Elijah knew that firing Victoria alone wouldn't address the underlying issues. "And the rest? We'll form a committee to evaluate our complaint procedures and diversity initiatives," Winters said. "I'd like you to serve on that committee, Captain Reynolds, if you're willing." Elijah considered the offer. Committees could be effective tools for change or bureaucratic dead ends designed to create the appearance of action while maintaining the status quo. "I'll serve," he agreed, "with the understanding that our recommendations will be implemented, not just considered." Winters began to object to this condition, but Admiral Washington intervened. "I think that's a reasonable request. In fact, I'll chair the committee myself to ensure its effectiveness." The meeting concluded with tentative agreements and scheduled follow-ups. As Elijah and Admiral Washington walked toward the elevators, the older man placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You did well in there," he said. "This is a different kind of navigation than flying a plane, but you're handling it with the same skill." "I'm not sure about that," Elijah admitted. This isn't what I signed up for when I became a pilot." The Admiral smiled slightly. "None of us sign up for the defining challenges of our lives, son. They find us regardless of our plans." As they rode the elevator down, Elijah received a text from Jasmine Williams. "We're outside, if you want to join us. No pressure either way. We've got your back whatever you decide." The elevator doors opened to reveal the building's marble lobby. Through the glass doors, Elijah could see the gathered employees and news cameras. For a moment, he hesitated, his natural inclination toward privacy conflicting with the opportunity before him. "What would you do?" he asked the Admiral. Washington considered the question carefully. 20 years ago, I might have advised caution. Keep your head down. Focus on flying, let others fight these battles. But today, he looked through the doors at the diverse group of aviation professionals united in purpose. Today, I'd say some moments choose us. The question is whether we're prepared to rise to them. Elijah took a deep breath, straightened his uniform, jacket, and made his decision. This was no longer just about one flight attendant's actions or his personal humiliation. It was about using his unexpected platform to create space for the voices and experiences of those who hadn't been captured on viral videos. As he pushed through the doors to join his colleagues, Elijah knew that whatever came next would be challenging, but he also knew that sometimes, the most important journeys weren't measured in nautical miles or flight hours, but in the courage to speak truth to systems that needed to change. What would you do in Elijah's position? Would you join the public demonstration or continue working behind the scenes? And do you think Victoria's family connections will allow her to escape genuine consequences? The battle for institutional change is just beginning. The headline on the aviation industry blog, Flight Deck Insider, seemed designed to provoke. Questions arise about Captain Reynolds' qualifications. Was Harrington right to be concerned? Elijah stared at his phone screen in disbelief. It had been 2 weeks since Victoria Harrington's termination, and he'd expected some backlash, but not a direct attack on his professional credentials. The article, written by someone identifying only as industry veteran, questioned whether Elijah's rapid promotion to the prestigious Johannesburg route had been merit-based or influenced by other factors. It cited anonymous sources claiming he had struggled during simulator training and had been given preferential treatment due to the airline's diversity agenda. "This is complete fiction," Elijah muttered to himself, scrolling through the article, with growing anger. His simulator scores had always been exceptional, and his path to the Johannesburg route had been paved with 15 years of perfect safety records and outstanding performance reviews. His phone rang, displaying Michael's name. "Have you seen it?" his co-pilot asked without preamble. "The hit piece on Flight Deck Insider?" "Just reading it now," Elijah confirmed. "It's all over pilot forums already," Michael said, his voice tight, with anger. "Someone's orchestrating this, Elijah. This isn't random backlash." Elijah had reached the same conclusion. The timing, the specific allegations that would be difficult to publicly disprove, the industry-focused nature of the attack, it all suggested a calculated effort to undermine his credibility within aviation circles. "Victoria's family," he said, the realization crystallizing. "They're trying to salvage her reputation by destroying mine." "The Harringtons have connections throughout the industry," Michael agreed. "Her uncle, Edward Harrington, sits on the board of Regional Airways and owns a major pilot training facility. He's got influence with aviation journalists, union representatives, you name it." Elijah had heard of Edward Harrington, a powerful figure known for his old-school mentality and resistance to changing the traditionally white male aviation culture. That Victoria was his niece explained much about her confidence in challenging a captain without consequences. "What's our next move?" Michael asked. The hour didn't escape Elijah's notice. Throughout this ordeal, Michael had remained steadfastly supportive, risking his own professional relationships by publicly standing with Elijah against discrimination. "For now, we document everything," Elijah decided. "And I need to give the airline PR team a heads up. This could escalate quickly." After ending the call, Elijah forwarded the article to Timothy Brooks in the communications department. The response came within minutes. The airline was aware of the piece, and was preparing a statement defending his qualifications and condemning the anonymous allegations. But the damage was already spreading. By afternoon, 2 more aviation blogs had picked up the story, adding their own embellishments. One questioned whether Elijah's relationship with Admiral Washington constituted improper favoritism. Another suggested he had been quick to play the race card when confronted about legitimate security concerns. The attacks weren't limited to professional forums. Social media accounts with aviation industry connections began sharing the articles, some adding personal anecdotes claiming to have witnessed Elijah's supposed incompetence firsthand. Though none provided specific flights or dates, the strategy was insidious and effective. Even without evidence, the repeated questioning of his qualifications created a cloud of doubt that was difficult to dispel completely. That evening, Elijah received a call from Jasmine Williams, the flight attendant who had replaced Victoria on the Johannesburg flight and who had organized the employee demonstration. "They're coming after me now," she said without preamble. "Someone anonymously reported me to HR for creating a hostile work environment by organizing the rally. I've been called in for questioning tomorrow." "That's retaliation," Elijah said immediately. "We'll fight it." "There's more," Jasmine continued. "Other employees who stood with us are getting similar treatment. Schedule changes, sudden performance, reviews, subtle hostility from managers. They're trying to isolate you by making your supporters pay a price." The realization that others were suffering for supporting him hit Elijah hard. "I never wanted anyone else to face backlash because of me." "This isn't because of you," Jasmine corrected him firmly. "This is because an entrenched system is being challenged. They'd come after us eventually anyway, just like they've been coming after you for your entire career." Her perspective helped, but Elijah still felt responsible for the expanding consequences. What had begun as a personal humiliation captured on video had evolved into something much larger, a direct challenge to power structures that had long gone unquestioned. The next morning brought news that a faction of Atlantic Skyways employees had formed a group supporting Victoria. Calling themselves Professionals for Proper Procedure, they released a statement claiming that Victoria had been unfairly terminated for following security protocols, and that the airline had sacrificed safety standards to appease social media outrage. The group's membership remained anonymous, but their statement was prominently featured on Edward Harrington's personal website, making the connection obvious. Elijah was reviewing their statement when he received an unexpected visitor at his apartment. Alicia Morales, Atlantic Skyways HR Director. HR. "This isn't an official visit," she clarified after he invited her in. "In fact, if anyone asks, we never had this conversation." Elijah raised an eyebrow but waited for her to continue. "You need to know what you're up against," Morales said, setting her tablet on Elijah's coffee table. "Victoria's uncle, Edward Harrington, is a major investor in Atlantic Skyways through his holding company. He owns 4% of our stock." "That's significant," Elijah acknowledged, understanding the implications immediately. "He's been calling board members individually, pressuring them to reverse Victoria's termination and issue a public statement that the airline overreacted to social media pressure." "And the diversity committee the CEO promised?" Elijah asked, already anticipating the answer. "Suddenly facing logistical challenges," Morales confirmed grimly. "Look, I've worked in HR for 20 years. I know a coordinated campaign when I see one. They're trying to wait out the public attention while systematically undermining your credibility within the industry." "Why are you telling me this?" Elijah asked directly. As HR director, Morales was part of the executive team, not someone he'd expect to risk her position by warning him. She hesitated before answering. "My father was one of the first Hispanic commercial pilots in the country. I grew up hearing his stories. Not the ones about exotic destinations, but the ones about being passed over for promotions, about passengers requesting different pilots, about colleagues questioning his English despite his perfect fluency." She met Elijah's eyes directly. "He never had a viral video to make people listen. He fought those battles alone and it broke something in him over time. I can't sit by and watch it happen again." Her unexpected allyship reminded Elijah that the battle lines in this conflict weren't simply drawn along racial boundaries, but between those who recognized systemic discrimination and those who benefited from denying its existence. "What can we do?" he asked. Document everything, Morales advised, and look for patterns larger than your individual case. Victoria's termination is just a symptom. The disease is a system that protected her until a viral video made that protection untenable. After Morales left, Elijah received another ominous development. A formal letter from a law firm representing Victoria Harrington, threatening legal action for defamation unless he publicly stated that her actions were based solely on security concerns rather than racial bias. The legal threat was clearly designed to intimidate rather than succeed in court. Victoria would have difficulty proving defamation when Elijah had barely spoken publicly about the incident. But fighting such a case would be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially damaging to his reputation regardless of the outcome. Elijah forwarded the letter to Admiral Washington, who responded immediately. They're getting desperate. Stand firm. My lawyers will handle this. That evening, Elijah received an unexpected phone call from Rebecca Martinez, the flight attendant who had been working with Victoria on the day of the incident. I've been wanting to reach out, she said hesitantly. I should have spoken up sooner about what happened that day. What do you mean? Elijah asked. Victoria knew exactly who you were, Rebecca revealed. After you left the cockpit, she made a comment about being surprised they'd choose someone like you for such a prestigious route. When I challenged her on what that meant, she changed the subject. This confirmation of what Elijah had suspected, that Victoria's failure to recognize him had been deliberate rather than accidental, wasn't surprising. But hearing it from a witness was validating. Would you be willing to make a statement to that effect? He asked. That's why I'm calling, Rebecca confirmed. I've already spoken to HR, and I'm not the only one coming forward. Other crew members who've worked with Victoria in the past are sharing similar experiences. The tide was beginning to turn. As the Harrington family escalated their attacks, they were inadvertently creating space for others to speak their truths. People who might have remained silent out of fear for their careers were finding courage in numbers. By the end of the week, another surprising ally emerged. Thomas Richards, the captain Victoria had mentioned knowing personally, whose route Elijah had supposedly taken. I've requested a meeting with the board, Richards informed Elijah during a phone call. Victoria's claim that she expected me on that route was completely fabricated. I was officially assigned to London 6 months ago, and she attended a dinner at her uncle's where this was explicitly discussed. You're willing to state that officially? Elijah asked, surprised by Richards' willingness to contradict Victoria's narrative. Absolutely, Richards confirmed. I've been flying for 30 years. I've seen too many good pilots held back because they didn't fit someone's image of what authority should look like. It's time aviation moved past these outdated biases. Richards' support was particularly significant, given his status as one of the airline's most senior captains. His willingness to speak out sent ripples through the pilot community, emboldening others to take public stands. The Harrington family's strategy had backfired in another crucial way. By attacking Elijah's professional qualifications, they had prompted many colleagues to vocally defend his exceptional record. Pilots who might have remained silent about discrimination spoke up enthusiastically about his skills and leadership. Despite this growing support, the constant attacks were taking a toll on Elijah. He found himself checking news sites and aviation forums compulsively, bracing for the next allegation. Sleep became elusive, and even simple decisions felt weighted with potential consequences. The stress affected his personal relationships as well. His parents called daily with concern. His sister wanted him to sue everyone involved, and friends from outside the industry couldn't fully understand the professional ramifications he faced. During this challenging period, Michael proved to be an invaluable ally, stopping by Elijah's apartment regularly with food and providing a sense of normalcy through their discussions of aviation topics unrelated to the controversy. You know, they're trying to break you, right? Michael said one evening as they reviewed flight plans for their upcoming return to Johannesburg. The constant attacks, the legal threats, the undermining of supporters. It's all designed to exhaust you into giving up. Elijah nodded. I know. Some days it's working. That's why you need to pace yourself, Michael advised. This isn't a sprint. It's a marathon, and you're not running it alone. That reminder that he wasn't facing this battle in isolation helped Elijah regain perspective. What had begun as his personal humiliation had evolved into a movement within the airline, with implications for the broader industry. As the third week after Victoria's termination began, Atlantic Skyways CEO Patricia Winters called an emergency board meeting to address the growing controversy. Both Elijah and Admiral Washington were invited to attend, a sign that the airline recognized the need for substantive engagement rather than just damage control. The outcome of that meeting would determine whether Atlantic Skyways would become a leader in addressing discrimination in aviation or would retreat to protecting the status quo. For Elijah, it would determine whether his unexpected platform would create lasting change or become merely another viral moment soon forgotten. The boardroom of Atlantic Skyways exuded corporate power. Mahogany panels lined the walls, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed Manhattan's skyline, and a massive table dominated the center, where 15 board members sat in leather chairs, their expressions ranging from concern to irritation to curiosity. Elijah took his assigned seat, acutely aware that he was the only black person in the room aside from Admiral Washington, who entered shortly after and took a place at the far end of the table. "Let's bring this meeting to order," said Franklin Pierce, the 72-year-old board chairman whose family had helped found the airline 3 generations earlier. "We're here to make a final determination regarding the Victoria Harrington situation and related matters." The clinical description of what had become a national conversation about race and authority in aviation wasn't lost on Elijah, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd learned long ago that in rooms like this, emotional reactions were often used to dismiss valid concerns. "For clarity," Pierce continued, "today's agenda includes 3 items. First, reviewing the termination of Victoria Harrington to determine if further action is warranted. Second, addressing the proposed diversity committee initially suggested by Captain Reynolds. And third, establishing a clear public position for Atlantic Skyways on these matters." CEO Patricia Winters took over. "Before we begin deliberations, Ms. Harrington has requested an opportunity to address the board directly. In the interest of thorough process, we've granted that request." Elijah's eyebrows rose slightly. He hadn't been informed that Victoria would be present, and he wondered if this was by design, another way to catch him off guard. When Victoria entered, she had transformed from the confident, somewhat haughty flight attendant he remembered into a picture of contrition. Her usually perfect hair was styled more conservatively, her makeup subtle, her navy suit modest and professional. "Thank you for allowing me to speak today," she began, her voice soft but steady. "The past month has been the most difficult of my professional life, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to address what I believe has been a serious misunderstanding." Elijah maintained his composure, while Victoria proceeded to present a narrative that bore little resemblance to what had actually transpired. In her telling, she had been a conscientious employee following security protocols who had been sacrificed to appease social media outrage. She emphasized her 12 years of exemplary service, her family's long history with aviation, and her personal commitment to professionalism. "At no point were my actions motivated by racial bias," she insisted, making brief eye contact with Elijah. "I would have responded exactly the same way to any individual attempting to board without proper identification, regardless of their race, gender, or position." When she finished, Pierce thanked her and asked if any board members had questions. An older board member whom Elijah didn't recognize spoke up. "Ms. Harrington, you stated you didn't recognize Captain Reynolds despite having met him in the cockpit earlier. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Victoria nodded, clearly prepared for this question. In the brief cockpit interaction, Captain Reynolds was wearing his full uniform with identifying insignia. Later, in the crowded terminal, without his uniform, jacket or captain's hat, and in the midst of pre-boarding chaos, I simply didn't connect that this was the same individual. Her explanation sounded rehearsed but plausible enough that several board members nodded in apparent understanding. Another board member, a woman in her 50s, pressed further. "Security footage shows you speaking with Captain Reynolds for over 45 seconds before calling security. That seems like ample time to recognize someone you had met face-to-face minutes earlier." Victoria's composure flickered briefly. "Terminal lighting is notoriously poor," and my attention was divided among many responsibilities. Before more questions could be asked, the boardroom door opened again, and a man Elijah recognized from news coverage entered. Edward Harrington, Victoria's uncle, whose influence in the aviation industry was legendary. "I apologize for the interruption," Harrington said smoothly, though his tone suggested he felt no need to apologize for anything. "As Victoria's family representative and a significant investor in Atlantic Skyways, I believe I have a right to participate in these proceedings." Pierce frowned at the intrusion but nodded stiffly. "You may observe, Mr. Harrington, but this is a board matter." Edward Harrington took a seat behind Victoria, his presence clearly bolstering her confidence. Elijah noted the dynamics at play, the visual statement of power and connection that Harrington's arrival represented. Admiral Washington, who had remained silent until now, spoke up.
"Since Mr. Harrington has joined us as a family representative, I believe it's appropriate to introduce additional evidence relevant to this case." He motioned toward the door, where a young woman from the airline's IT department entered with
a laptop. "With the board's permission, I'd like to present security footage that wasn't included in the initial investigation." Pierce hesitated, but nodded his assent. The IT specialist connected her laptop to the boardroom's display system, and suddenly the large screen at the end of the room showed a high-angle view of the gate area from the day of the incident. "This footage begins 15 minutes before the confrontation," Washington explained. "I'd like to direct your attention to this interaction." The video clearly showed Victoria speaking with another flight attendant, pointing toward the cockpit, and then making a phone call. The timestamp indicated this occurred just after her cockpit meeting with Elijah and before the confrontation at the gate. "The airline's phone records, which I've taken the liberty of reviewing as a board member," Washington continued, "show that Ms. Harrington called her uncle at this exact time." Edward Harrington shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Washington continued. "Furthermore, if we advance the footage to Ms. Harrington's supposed failure to recognize Captain Reynolds, the video now showed the confrontation from an angle different than the viral video, clearly capturing Victoria's face as Elijah approached. Her expression showed no confusion or lack of recognition. Instead, there was a subtle but unmistakable look of determination, as if executing a plan rather than reacting to a security concern. Most damning of all, the footage showed Victoria deliberately turning away when Elijah attempted to show her his digital credentials on his phone before claiming he had no identification. The boardroom fell silent as the footage concluded. Victoria's carefully constructed narrative had crumbled in the face of objective evidence. "I believe," Washington said into the silence, "this footage demonstrates that Ms. Harrington's actions were premeditated rather than a good faith response to security concerns." Victoria turned to her uncle, her expression panicked. But Edward Harrington was already on his feet. "This is a witch hunt," he declared angrily. "I've known many of you on this board for decades. Are you really going to allow a distinguished aviation family to be publicly humiliated over what remains, at worst, a misunderstanding?" His attempt to invoke personal connections might have worked in the past, but the clear evidence on display had shifted the atmosphere in the room. "Mr. Harrington," Pierce said firmly, "the evidence speaks for itself. Ms. Harrington appears to have deliberately targeted Captain Reynolds and then misrepresented her actions to this board." Victoria stood suddenly. "This is absurd. I've spent my entire career upholding the highest standards of this airline. I would never—" "Never what, Ms. Harrington?" Elijah asked, speaking for the first time since she had entered. "Never question a black pilot's authority? Never assume someone who doesn't look like your mental image of a captain must be an imposter?" Victoria's face flushed. "This isn't about race. It's about security protocols and proper identification." "If that were true," Elijah replied calmly, "you wouldn't have ignored my digital credentials or failed to contact my first officer for verification. Both standard protocols you chose to bypass." Edward Harrington interjected, his voice rising. "The real issue here is the airline's eagerness to elevate diversity candidates regardless of qualification. If we're being honest, Captain Reynolds' rapid promotion to international routes raised legitimate concerns among experienced aviation professionals. The room fell silent at this explicit statement of what had been implied in the online attacks. Victoria looked horrified at her uncle's blunt articulation of what she had been careful to only insinuate. Admiral Washington stood slowly, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. "Mr. Harrington, I've known you for 30 years, and, in that time, I've watched you fight every diversity initiative in this industry, while claiming it was about maintaining standards." He walked toward Elijah, placing a hand on his shoulder. Captain Reynolds graduated first in his class at flight school. His simulator scores are in the top 2% of all Atlantic pilots. He has logged over 15,000 flight hours, without a single safety incident. So I have to ask, what legitimate concerns could possibly exist about his qualifications other than the color of his skin? Edward Harrington's face darkened with anger, but before he could respond, a board member who had been silent until now spoke up. Rebecca Chen, the youngest member of the board and the only Asian American in the room. "If I may," she said, clearing her throat nervously, "I'd like to present some data I've compiled for today's meeting." She distributed tablets to each board member. These charts show hiring and promotion patterns at Atlantic Skyways over the past 15 years. As you can see, while our entry-level positions approximate national demographic percentages, our mid-level and executive positions show significant disparities. The data was compelling and meticulously presented. It showed not just racial disparities but gender imbalances as well, particularly in technical roles like pilots and mechanics. More troubling, Rebecca continued, her confidence growing as she presented her research, is the pattern of complaint dismissals. She swiped to a new chart. Complaints filed by white employees are 3 times more likely to result in corrective action than identical complaints filed by employees of color. Edward Harrington scoffed audibly. This is the problem with today's corporate environment. Everything becomes about identity politics rather than merit and experience. His dismissive comment seemed to ignite something in Victoria, who had been watching her carefully constructed defense crumble. She turned to her uncle with unexpected anger. "This is exactly why I'm in this situation," she snapped. "Your generation taught us to think one way while telling us to speak another. You told me at dinner last month that they were giving roots to diversity hires who couldn't handle them. But now you expect me to pretend this was all about security protocols?" The room fell silent at this unintended confession. Victoria seemed to realize too late what she had revealed in her emotional outburst. "I didn't mean," she began, but the damage was done. Franklin Pierce raised his hand to silence further debate. "I believe we've heard enough to make an informed decision. I'll ask non-board members to step outside while we deliberate." Elijah, Victoria, and Edward Harrington were escorted from the boardroom into separate waiting areas. As Elijah sat in a small conference room, reviewing the rapid shifts that had occurred during the meeting, he felt a complex mixture of emotions: vindication at the exposure of Victoria's deliberate actions, concern about the board's ultimate decision, and a deep weariness at having to prove yet again that his experiences of discrimination were real. 30 minutes later, he was called back into the boardroom. Victoria and her uncle were not present. Pierce addressed him directly. "Captain Reynolds, the board has reached several decisions I'd like to share with you." Elijah nodded, maintaining his professional composure despite the tension of the moment. "First, Ms. Harrington's termination has been unanimously upheld. Furthermore, the board has determined that her actions constituted willful misconduct, making her ineligible for any severance benefits," Pierce continued, his tone formal, but with an undertone of genuine regret. "Second, we acknowledge that Atlantic Skyways has failed to adequately address systemic issues of bias within our organization. The data presented today makes that painfully clear." He glanced at Admiral Washington before proceeding. "Therefore, we are immediately establishing a diversity and inclusion task force with genuine authority to review and revise our hiring, promotion, and complaint procedures. Admiral Washington has agreed to co-chair this task force, and we would like you to serve as the other co-chair if you're willing." The offer surprised Elijah. He had expected a token committee with limited power, the typical corporate response to controversy, not a task force with genuine authority co-chaired by a board member. "Finally," Pierce concluded, The board wishes to formally apologize for what you experienced and for our slow response to your concerns. Atlantic Skyways should have stood unequivocally with you from the moment this incident occurred. The apology, unexpected and seemingly sincere, caught Elijah off guard. Throughout his career, he had grown accustomed to having his experiences minimized or explained away. Explicit acknowledgement from the airline's highest authority represented a significant shift. "Thank you, Mr. Pierce," Elijah replied carefully. "I accept your apology in the co-chair position, with one condition, that the task force include representatives from all levels of the airline, not just executives and management." Pierce nodded. "That's a reasonable request. We'll ensure diverse representation across departments and positions." As the meeting concluded, Elijah realized that this moment represented not just personal vindication, but a potential turning point for Atlantic Skyways. The viral video that had captured his humiliation had ultimately forced a reckoning that might not have happened otherwise. Outside the boardroom, Admiral Washington waited for him. "Well done in there," he said quietly. "Now the real work begins." Elijah nodded, understanding the truth in those words. Public attention would eventually shift to new controversies, new viral moments. The lasting impact would depend on the structural changes they could implement while the spotlight remained on their cause. As they walked toward the elevators, Washington added, "Victoria's uncle is threatening to divest his shares in the airline and use his influence to turn others against us. Do you think he'll succeed?" Elijah asked. The Admiral smiled slightly. "Edward Harrington represents an approach to aviation that's fading into history. His influence isn't what it once was, especially now that his tactics have been exposed." The elevator doors opened, revealing Jasmine Williams waiting in the lobby, surrounded by a diverse group of airline employees who had gathered in silent support. "They've been here all morning," Washington explained. "Word got out about the, board meeting." As Elijah approached the group, Jasmine stepped forward. "What happened up there?" "The board upheld Victoria's termination," Elijah told her, loud enough for everyone to hear, "and they've committed to a task force with actual authority to address systemic issues. The Admiral and I will co-chair." A spontaneous cheer erupted from the gathered employees, their relief and hope palpable after weeks of uncertainty. That moment, Elijah felt the weight of their expectations, their trust that he would use this platform to create meaningful change rather than accept symbolic gestures. Looking at their faces, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, young, veteran, Elijah recognized that what had begun as his personal humiliation had transformed into something much larger. A long overdue conversation about who belonged in aviation's positions of authority and whose experiences were validated. The hard work of institutional change was just beginning, but for the first time since that day at JFK, Elijah felt genuine optimism about the possibility of progress. The turning point had arrived, not just for him or for Atlantic Skyways, but potentially for an industry that had resisted change for far too long. 6 months later, Elijah guided the Dreamliner into its final approach to Johannesburg International Airport. The golden African sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape below. In the co-pilot seat, Michael monitored the instruments with practiced precision. "Atlantic 427, cleared to land runway go 3R, wind 090 at 6 knots, came the controller's voice through their headsets. "Atlantic 427, cleared to land 03R, Elijah confirmed, his hands steady on the controls, as he aligned the aircraft for landing. The touchdown was perfect, the massive aircraft settling onto the runway with barely a bump. As they taxied toward the gate, Elijah allowed himself a moment of reflection. This route, once the site of such turbulence in his career, had now become a familiar journey. 6 monthly round trips later, the Johannesburg route was established as one of Atlantic Skyways' most successful international connections. "Nice landing, Captain," Michael commented as they completed the shutdown checklist. "As usual." "Just doing my job," Elijah replied with a slight smile. "No better, no worse than any other qualified pilot." It had become something of a mantra between them, a humorous acknowledgement of the absurdity of having his skills questioned based on his race rather than his performance. After completing their post-flight procedures, Elijah made his way through the terminal. Several of the regular ground staff greeted him by name, a far cry from his first landing when cameras and journalists had awaited him. The story that had once dominated social media had receded from public attention, as all viral moments eventually do. But while the spotlight had moved on, the impact remained. The James Washington Initiative for Aviation Equity, named after the admiral at Elijah's insistence, had transformed from a crisis response task force into a permanent program at Atlantic Skyways. Its achievements over the past 6 months were already substantial. Revised hiring practices, a complete overhaul of the complaint system, mandatory inclusion training for all employees, and a mentorship program for underrepresented groups in technical positions. Most significantly, the airline had committed to doubling the number of Black, Hispanic, and female pilots within 5 years through targeted recruitment and training programs. Elijah himself had become deeply involved in this effort, speaking at high schools and colleges about careers in aviation. At the hotel, a message awaited him from Jasmine Williams, who had been promoted to Senior Cabin Services Manager, overseeing international crew training. Her message was brief but significant. The Washington Initiative's first class of pilot trainees just completed their initial assessments. All 20 passed. 5 received perfect scores. The future is looking up. Elijah smiled at the news. Those 20 trainees represented a deliberate effort to identify talented individuals from backgrounds traditionally underrepresented in cockpits. Their success validated what he had always known. Excellence wasn't confined to any one demographic. After settling into his room, Elijah reviewed his schedule for the next day. Beyond his regular piloting duties, he had agreed to meet with South African Airways officials interested in implementing similar diversity initiatives. His unplanned role as an advocate for change had expanded beyond Atlantic Skyways, creating opportunities to influence the broader industry. That evening, as he dined in the hotel restaurant, a familiar figure caught his eye at the hotel bar: Victoria Harrington. The sight of her was jarring. In the months since their last encounter in the boardroom, he had thought of her occasionally, but more as a symbol of systemic problems than as an individual. Seeing her in person brought back the raw emotions of that day at JFK. Victoria noticed him at almost the same moment. Her expression shifted rapidly from shock to embarrassment, to a carefully neutral mask. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Elijah returned the nod, equally reserved. He had no desire for confrontation, but neither did he feel any obligation to ease her discomfort. To his surprise, Victoria gathered her things and approached his table. "Captain Reynolds," she said, her voice hesitant. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I fly this route regularly now," he replied simply. "What brings you to Johannesburg?" "I'm working for Southern Regional now," she explained, naming a much smaller carrier known primarily for short domestic routes. "My first international assignment since everything happened." The unspoken history hung between them: her deliberate humiliation of him, her termination, the subsequent industry-wide conversation about racism in aviation. "May I sit for a moment?" she asked unexpectedly. Elijah hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair across from him. He was curious about what she might say, though not particularly invested in her redemption narrative, if that's what she was seeking. "I owe you an apology," Victoria began after sitting down. "A genuine one, not the PR statement my uncle's lawyers wrote for me." Elijah remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "What I did was wrong," she said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "Not just unprofessional, but deliberately harmful. I knew exactly who you were that day. I called security because I didn't think you belonged in that captain's seat, and I believed I had the authority to make that judgment." Her candor was unexpected. Elijah had assumed she would offer qualified apologies or deflections, not this direct acknowledgement of her motivations. "Why tell me this now?" he asked. Victoria looked down at her hands. "Because 6 months at a regional carrier starting over at 40 has been a humbling experience." Because I've had time to reflect on the beliefs I never questioned growing up in my family, and because my therapist says I'll never move forward without acknowledging the harm I caused. Elijah nodded, appreciating her honesty if not fully trusting her transformation. Thank you for saying that. I don't expect forgiveness, Victoria clarified quickly. I just wanted you to know that what happened didn't leave me unchanged. I've had to confront a lot of ugly truths about myself and my industry. The industry is changing, Elijah observed. Slowly, but it's changing. Because of you in part, Victoria acknowledged. The Washington Initiative is becoming a model for other airlines. Even Southern Regional is implementing some of its recommendations. Their conversation was interrupted by a young black woman in a Southern Regional uniform approaching their table. Ms. Harrington, the crew is gathering in the lobby for dinner, she said, then noticed Elijah. Her eyes widened in recognition. Captain Reynolds, it's an honor to meet you, sir. This is Imani, one of our new flight attendants, Victoria introduced her. She's actually part of Southern Regional's new professional development program, studying for her pilot's license while working as cabin crew. Following in your footsteps, Captain, Imani said with evident admiration. Your story inspired me to pursue flying commercially instead of just recreationally. The moment captured the strange dichotomy of Elijah's unwanted fame. The humiliation caught on video had also created visibility that was inspiring others to enter a field where they might not have seen themselves represented before. After Imani excused herself, promising to give Victoria a few more minutes, an awkward silence fell between the former adversaries. I should go, Victoria said finally, but I meant what I said. I'm sorry for what I did, and I'm trying to be better. As she stood to leave, Elijah spoke. Victoria, the hardest part wasn't the public humiliation or even having my qualifications questioned. It was knowing that no matter what I achieved, some people would always see my skin color before they saw my captain's stripes. Victoria nodded, accepting his words without defensiveness. I understand that better now. Not completely. I can't claim to fully understand an experience I haven't lived, but I'm listening and learning, for whatever that's worth. After she left, Elijah remained at his table, reflecting on their unexpected encounter. Victoria's apparent growth didn't erase what she had done, but it suggested that meaningful change was possible, even in individuals who had seemed most resistant to it. The following morning, Elijah attended a special ceremony at the South African Airways training facility. What had been scheduled as a routine meeting had evolved into something more significant after officials learned of his presence in Johannesburg. Before an audience of trainee pilots, many of whom were black South Africans who had grown up during or just after apartheid, Elijah was presented with an honorary pilot's wings pin, a gesture recognizing his inadvertent but important role in challenging discrimination in global aviation. Captain Reynolds didn't set out to become a symbol, the South African Airways director stated during the presentation. He simply insisted on being treated with the same respect accorded to any other highly qualified captain. In doing so, he reminded us all that the cockpit should be a meritocracy in the truest sense, where skill, knowledge, and judgment are the only relevant criteria. Accepting the honorary wings, Elijah was moved by the significance of this recognition. In a country with its own complex history of racial segregation and progress toward equality, the parallels were not lost on him or on the young pilots watching the ceremony. After the formal proceedings, several trainee pilots approached him with questions about his career path and the challenges he had faced. Their eagerness reminded him of his own younger self, the aviation-obsessed teenager who had met Admiral Washington at an airshow, never imagining the journey that lay ahead. 6 days later, as Elijah prepared for takeoff from Johannesburg back to New York, he received a message from Admiral Washington. Board meeting yesterday. The Washington Initiative's funding doubled for next year. Your impact continues to grow, even when you're soaring above the clouds. Elijah smiled at the Admiral's characteristic blend of mentorship and pride. At 68, Washington remained a powerful force for change within the airline and the broader industry, using his position on the board to ensure that the momentum created by the viral incident wasn't lost. As the Dreamliner climbed into the clear African sky, Elijah felt a sense of peace that had been elusive in the months immediately following the confrontation with Victoria. What had begun as a deeply personal humiliation had evolved into something with far greater significance, a catalyst for examining and addressing patterns of discrimination that had persisted for generations. Not everyone had embraced these changes, of course. Edward Harrington and others like him continued to resist the shifting culture, clinging to outdated notions of who belonged in positions of authority. But their influence was waning, their arguments increasingly falling on unreceptive ears in an industry that was finally beginning to reflect the diverse world it served. 3 months later, Atlantic Skyways held a special ceremony honoring the first graduating class of the Washington Initiative's pilot training program. Standing before the 20 graduates, Admiral Washington spoke briefly before introducing Elijah as the keynote speaker. When I met Elijah Reynolds at an air show many years ago, I saw a young man with extraordinary potential who faced extraordinary barriers, the Admiral recalled. Today, I see 20 young people with similar potential, and I'm proud that some of those barriers are finally being dismantled. As Elijah took the podium, he looked out at the diverse faces of the graduates, men and women of various racial backgrounds, all united by their demonstrated excellence and their passion for aviation. Your presence here today represents more than personal achievement, he told them. It represents a new horizon for our industry, one where excellence is recognized regardless of what the excellent individual looks like. He shared stories from his own journey, including both the challenges and the triumphs, before concluding with a reflection on the incident that had inadvertently elevated his platform. A single phone call changed the trajectory of my career in ways I never anticipated, he acknowledged. But the real change comes not from viral moments or individual confrontations, but from the sustained commitment to making our cockpits, our cabins, and our entire industry reflect the diversity of the passengers we serve. As the graduates received their wings, Elijah felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The humiliation captured on video had been transformed into a powerful catalyst for change, creating opportunities for these graduates that might otherwise have been delayed for years or decades. Admiral Washington joined him as the ceremony concluded. "You've built something remarkable here, son," the older man said quietly. "Something that will outlast both of us." "We built it together," Elijah corrected him. "Along with every pilot who faced discrimination but kept flying anyway, every flight attendant who challenged biased systems, every ground crew member who refused to accept the status quo." The Admiral nodded in acknowledgement. "True enough, but someone needed to be the visible face of that collective struggle at a crucial moment. That burden fell to you, and you carried it with extraordinary grace." As they watched the graduates celebrating with their families, Elijah reflected on how differently things might have turned out if Victoria Harrington had recognized him that day at JFK, or if he had chosen not to make that crucial phone call to the Admiral. Some might call it fate or destiny, but Elijah preferred to see it as the intersection of preparation and opportunity. He had been prepared through years of excellence in his field, and when the opportunity arose, however unwelcome it initially seemed, to address larger issues of discrimination, he had been ready to meet the moment. The journey that had begun with a humiliating confrontation at an airport gate had led to a new horizon, not just for Elijah Reynolds, but for an entire industry long overdue for change. That horizon now stretched before him, filled with possibilities, for those who would follow the trail he had helped to blaze. Have you ever witnessed someone turn a negative experience into positive change? How do you think Elijah's story will influence the aviation industry moving forward? Please share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe if you want to hear more stories of triumph over discrimination, and give this video a like if you found Elijah's journey inspiring. Thank you for joining us today. And remember, sometimes our most difficult moments can lead to our greatest impact. This powerful story of Captain Elijah Reynolds teaches us several important lessons about confronting discrimination and creating meaningful change. First, excellence remains our strongest response to prejudice. Elijah's impeccable qualifications and composed professionalism ultimately proved impossible to dismiss. Second, documentation is crucial when facing bias. The security footage that captured Victoria's deliberate actions provided irrefutable evidence that verbal testimony alone could not. The narrative also demonstrates how systems often protect those who discriminate until public pressure becomes unavoidable. Victoria's previous complaints were buried until a viral video forced accountability. Additionally, we see the vital importance of allies across racial lines. Michael, Rebecca, Admiral Washington, and others who use their positions of privilege to support justice rather than remaining silent. Perhaps most significantly, Elijah's journey shows that lasting change requires moving beyond individual accountability to address institutional structures. His greatest impact wasn't Victoria's termination, but the transformation of airline policies and the creation of pathways for future diverse aviators. Finally, we learn that finding your voice after experiencing discrimination isn't just personal healing. It can create opportunities for countless others who will follow in your path. Has racial discrimination ever impacted your professional life or someone you know? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story matters and could help others facing similar challenges. If Elijah's courage in transforming a humiliating moment into positive industry change inspired you, hit that like button to help more people discover this important story. Do you believe corporations should be held accountable for addressing systemic discrimination, or is change ultimately an individual responsibility? Comment accountability or individual to join this crucial conversation. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience and justice in professional settings. Hit that notification bell to never miss our new uploads featuring people who turn discrimination into determination. Thank you for watching this journey of courage, resilience, and transformation. Remember that standing up against discrimination isn't just about personal vindication. It's about creating a more equitable future for everyone. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today.